All right. Well, welcome. Welcome to the panel on trust. Okay, this is a fascinating concept for a panel because a lot of the things that we talk about here are very, very concrete. I was just on a panel last night about the Dobbs ruling. That's a very, very concrete issue. But this one is much more abstract, but incredibly vitally important. If there's one thing that we have complete consensus on in this country, and there are very, very few things, one of them that the Southeastern Conference is the best football conference. But other than that, we have very little consensus. But one thing we have consensus on is that we don't trust each other. So I have this tremendous panel, and as the moderator, I feel like I should just be quiet immediately and just say go, but I can't do that. This is a tremendous panel of people who think about, and both in the world of ideas, descriptively and prescriptively, what can we do about trust? So from my left, I don't know which direction it is, but this way, Chloe Valdery. Chloe is founder of Theory of Enchantment. Thomas Chatterton Williams with The Atlantic. Eric Liu, Citizen University. All of their bios are much more impressive than that one sentence description, but we'll just go with that for now. So let's just start with descriptive. And we don't want to just talk today about institutional trust, like do you trust the police or the judiciary or big business? We want to talk about trust at an institutional level, but very vitally and importantly at an interpersonal level. And so let me start with Thomas. I'm just going to give you a really big, broad question. As you live in France and you spend a ton of time here in the United States. When you come back across the pond and you're re-entering American society, and when you think of trust, what are you observing?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
I've lived in France for the past 11 years, and over the course of that time, coming back to the States very regularly, I've come to look at America more and more through the eyes of a European, even though when I'm in Europe I feel very American. And some of what I see is pretty shocking. One of the biggest changes that I've noticed in the past decade, certainly, is the degree to which all of our values, arguments, principles have become so rooted in our identities. And that has really dissolved our ability to respectfully disagree with one another, because I can disagree with your argument. I can say I have different principles and values than you, and we can try to hash that out. But you cannot disagree with someone's identity. And that's why the stakes seem so high now. And so I really notice that everything seems at the highest level, and it's ready to explode. And you know, there are problems in France. It's not a utopia. There are problems in Europe, but I don't feel that level of the pressure cooker, and I don't feel that all of the arguments are rooted in identity. For one concrete example, a lot of French people didn't want to wear masks, and President Macron, he basically said, "It's over. We're not the subject's closed. We're not going to argue this anymore. You have to wear masks, or you can't do anything." It was basically over. There was no anti-mask identity right. that became part of people's whole being and made it that they were ready to get violent over a piece of cloth on their face. So, I mean, that just really, really struck me every time I'd come back during COVID.
So, Chloe, there was a wonderful profile of your work in The Atlantic. It was Connor Friedersdorf, right, who wrote it. So you're working in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. And so you're going into institutions and interacting with people within institutions. What are you seeing when you enter institutions about the degree of interpersonal trust within institutions as you launch into education, launch into engagement on some of the most hot-button identity-based issues in the United States?
So a lot of the institutions and organizations that come to Theory of Enchantment, and we are an anti-racism organization, they come to us after having gone through another anti-racist training. And that training has usually wreaked havoc in the workplace. And it's caused self-segregation. It's caused people from different ethnic backgrounds to become even more hostile towards each other. And so they're coming to us actually for repair and for healing. And they are looking for an approach that is far more holistic and very intentional about sowing seeds of trust. And we state very explicitly at Theory of Enchantment that our goal is to teach people how to love. If you're fighting against racism, if you're fighting against any form of bigotry, ultimately, what you are in service of is learning how to love. And so people really crave that, organizations really crave that, but they are coming to us after having gone through something that was sowing seeds of distrust and holding distrust and mistrust up as a goal and as an objective.
So Eric, you first kind of describe what Citizen University does, and as you're describing it, talk a bit about people who are coming into your program and what is their state of being. Because you do an enormous amount of work at the grassroots that builds connection with people. But I'm presuming the connection often isn't there to begin with. You're having to build from, you're obviously building something that isn't there to begin with. So you've been doing this across the country throughout some of the most polarized years in modern American history. So if you could kind of talk about that and what you're seeing of people as they're coming in.
Yeah, David, I think one of the things that is worth remembering is just a little bit of context. When you talk about, in our work at Citizen University and also the program I run here at Aspen on citizenship and American identity, we're trying to teach people how to see one another again. This is a cultural piece of work, not a structural policy piece of work. I really resonate with what Chloe was saying. And when Thomas talks about the ways in which identity, differences on opinions or issues don't get bound up with identity the way, in other places the way they do here, it's worth remembering why. Right? I mean, we are a centrifugal, diverse, pluralistic society that from the beginning has had relatively little to hold us together. And Tocqueville, the French-American connection, Tocqueville warned us about how democracy was going to level everybody in a way that made everybody feel atomized and alone, falling upon themselves only to figure stuff out, right? Congratulations, you're free, now go, you're on your own. And so, David, when I think about the communities we work in, to build trust, to build bonds of trust and affection, it's not only that, they don't have it, they don't know how to do this, it's that most of the default settings of American life work against doing this. We live in a hyper-individualistic society. The messages we get from the marketplace, the messages we get from popular culture are all about the rugged individual, right? Figuring it out on their own. And I think there is this prior body of work that is spiritual almost, civic spiritual, about seeing the ways in which we are connected in the first place. And at Citizen University, one of the pieces of work that we do is these gatherings called Civic Saturdays, which are essentially a civic analog to a faith gathering. It's not church or synagogue or mosque, but it has the arc and the flow and the feel of such a thing on purpose. Because Americans today, whether they are super churched and engaged in religious life or not, are feeling disengaged from one another, disconnected, right? Trust isn't the problem right now. Right now in America, we trust people who are just like us, right? The problem is trust across lines of identity and difference. And so Civic Saturday is meant to invite people across those lines of difference and different dimensions of identity into a space where we try to make sense of this moment, not in a dogmatic, here's the answer kind of way, but in a, how can we figure this out together? And at Aspen, we have a project which in a prior session I was telling some folks about called the Better Arguments Project. It's a partnership with the Aspen Institute, Allstate, and a wonderful nonprofit called Facing History and Ourselves, which is very aptly named because the idea of this project is you can come in not trusting each other. You can come in feeling disconnected from another. You can come in, I was just talking to someone here today who works in education and whose district was overrun by the polarization first around masks and then around CRT, critical race theory, and these professional educators who for years have just been trying to do right by the kids are swamped by this kind of toxic top-down, talking points-driven polarization. And what we're trying to teach people like that to do is not to run away from the argument. People are going to disagree, but how to have less stupid, less dehumanizing, less polarizing arguments that are about the ways in which we are pluralistic. We are going to come to the same issue from different points of view. And the maybe counterintuitive idea is you can come together by arguing better, by learning how to do that with love, with a sense of humility. And we're seeing that happen in places because, David, your work is testament to the fact that there is an exhausted majority in this country. Most of our politics is not, in fact, driven by the most vocal wings. But that exhausted majority does not have tools, skills, or invitation in the way that we're all trying to create. And I think that's the only way you build trust is by giving people an invitation into something to do together.
So Clay, I'm really intrigued by what you just said. You're coming into a workplace that's a mess. And you're coming into a place, it's not just a workplace, it's not just a mess because people are leaving old food in the fridge. It's a mess because they're divided over race.
Yeah.
And you're part of the solution. Walk us through how you start to interact with people who are angry and mistrustful with each other over this, one of the most sensitive issues that we can talk about in any space.
Yeah, so I would say that there are 3 organizing principles of the theory of enchantment. They are treat people like human beings, not political abstractions, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy, and try to root everything you do in love and compassion. Now, these may sound very simple, and they are simple, but they're actually very difficult to put into practice. Because let's take the first one. Treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. What does it actually mean to be a human being? We start with this very simple question, and we ground practices and exercises in unpacking this question. So for example, in one of the workshops that we do, the first thing we start with is a who am I game. And I say, we're going to take 3 minutes, and I want you to ask yourself the question, who am I? And for every answer that comes to you, write it down and silently say to yourself, thank you. And be sure to include those aspects of yourself that you do not like. And also remember to say thank you. And this practice is very important because when we caricaturize others, when we stereotype others, we are simultaneously stereotyping ourselves. A very quick example. In some contexts, I am hardworking, right? In other contexts, I can be super lazy, right? Both of these are elements of who I am, depending upon the context. If I can learn how to get in right relationship with that fullness of myself, I will be less likely to project the stereotype of laziness onto another group of people. And if I do that, what's actually happening is I am being insecure about how that shows up in my own life, and I'm projecting it onto the other. And so part of this work of building trust and teaching people how to love actually is all about teaching people how to get in right relationship with themselves. Because the seed of supremacy, people have to understand that supremacy, no matter the flavor, is an overcompensation for insecurity. If you are feeling secure within yourself, you will feel no need to bring another group of people down in order to feel good about yourself. So that is the seed. And so the question becomes, how do we deal with insecurity, both on a material level, but also on a psychological level? And how do we learn to get in right relationship with the fullness of ourselves such that we stop projecting it onto the other? The name of this panel is all about trusting the other. How do you trust the other? You have to get in right relationship with the other that is present within yourself. And that is difficult work, and it's also work that takes a lifetime.
So Thomas, you and I have a disadvantage when it comes to the concept of trust, because we're in the media.
We're in the what?
Media.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody likes us. I long to go back to being a litigator, a trial lawyer, because people like lawyers better than journalists. But we have a huge challenge. How do we build trust in our institution, in the world of ideas? And Thomas and I, just for little background between us, we don't know each other well, but we have gone through one tremendous bonding experience. We have been dragged on Twitter together as a unit. So that,
from different directions.
From different directions. So that has bonded us forever. So how do you, as somebody who's operating in the media and the world of ideas, think about building trust in the institution that we belong to?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a complicated one. Social media is really a problem for journalists. I'm part of the problem, and I can say that with authority. An editor at the New York Times, where I used to write, told me Twitter's essentially a machine for people to complain about and want to destroy journalists. And it really is that, and journalists are caught up in this dynamic that doesn't serve us well. So I admit that we do a lot to kind of make our own trustworthiness come into question when we share too many opinions, and we make ourselves less objective seeming that way. But one thing that we can do in our institutions to try to build trust is to try to hold them to account. And so one thing that I did that you were involved with was with a group of other writers is we drafted a letter when we felt things were going askew at the New York Times and other places, and we published this letter in Harper's, and we collected signatures from various writers and intellectuals we respected, and we tried to say, these are principles we believe in, we want to live up to these principles, and we see that in many ways in the culture, these principles are being run roughshod over, and we tried to kind of build a consensus in the public conversation that way. That backfired in a lot of ways. I mean, we got a lot of support, but it became quite a divisive document. So, that was our attempt at trying to shore up trust. But oftentimes, in hindsight, you can see that things you do that you think are in service of trust actually add to the polarization, because there were things that we just couldn't anticipate, such as the invisible connections people would read into certain names that were on the document.
Yeah.
And that made them distrust it
Right.
even more. So it's a good question, and I wish I had a better answer. I think all you can do is try to show that you're willing to critique yourself, you're willing to critique your own side, and you're willing to express humility when you do come up short and you're wrong.
So Eric, one of the things that I think is, it's easy to talk about how we can bring people together and talk in sort of idealistic terms about, well, all it takes is actually just getting people into a room, and all it takes is, getting people to humanize each other. But if it was that easy, we wouldn't be where we are. And so you've had a lot of success at getting people in, across some pretty big divides. But let me ask you this. How do you deal with the unreasonables, the unpersuadables? Because those folks are out there.
You deal with them second, not first. I think the first priority has to be, that term I used earlier, the exhausted majority, is not a term I made up. It comes from a body of research from a great organization called More in Common that does this deep textured analysis of public opinion and sentiment, and has a report that's become kind of iconic that has a taxonomy of where people are in their sense of political orthodoxy, right? And you have orthodox kind of extremes, but you have this broad exhausted majority. And that exhausted majority is not just tired of the binary. They are also, as Chloe's saying, fully aware of their own complexity, fully aware that they are liberal in some ways and conservative in others, fully aware that they love people who are completely opposite from them in their worldview and politics. And they are tired, what they're tired of is the flattening, the two-dimensionalizing of the political culture, right? And I think we at Citizen University, the Better Arguments Project with Aspen and Facing History, is trying to reach that exhausted majority first, right? That's the critical mass. And I think, as we've seen, over and over again in these last few years, to make to make change in our society, and we've seen it maybe in change that is not welcome to some of us even this week, you don't need 50% plus one. Majority rule, even where it prevails, is driven by minority will. You just need an activated, passionate, powerful minority of people who are going to commit to showing up together and doing this stuff. And what you said earlier is, getting people together, that's not going to solve stuff. It's not going to solve stuff. But you're not going to solve stuff without first rehumanizing in the first place. It is necessary but insufficient, right? And I think when people just try to skip over to, let's talk about policy, let's talk about the buzzwords, let's do CRT right now, no, you know how that's going to end, right? But if we have some humanizing foundation upon which to build both that search for some consensus and that willingness to agree, it does, now, the part where you're talking about the unreasonables, and I think this is what others have called the paradox of tolerance, right? Tolerating the intolerant puts open societies, puts a liberal democracy always at risk. Because the insurrectionists, the January 6 folks, the people who would like to, be super illiberal, are coming to power through liberal democratic means right now, right? And it was John Adams who said there was never a democracy yet that didn't eventually commit suicide. And so the question, again, back to us in the exhausted majority is, how do we contain the spread of that kind of behavior, right? And the way has to be still for us to do what you're just hearing right now, to see the complexity in people, to recognize, to take some risks, right? That letter, the Harper's letter that y'all did, was risky.
Which Chloe signed too, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It was risky, and and you paid a certain price for it, right? And the question right now is not just like, are you willing to step into a circle of discomfort? The question right now is, what are you willing to pay? What are you willing to pay, reputationally, social capital-wise, otherwise, to be in conversation, to be in engagement with the other? And if none of us is willing to pay, then we cede the field to the people who are, in fact, running the field right now.
And I didn't sign the letter only because I didn't see the email until the letter was out.
We've talked about this before, actually.
Yes,
I forgot that detail.
I would have totally signed it. I didn't see the email. But we did a New York Times op-ed together against these anti-CRT bills.
That's where we started to really get the hatred together.
That's where we were in the foxhole together.
Yeah,
absolutely. So, Chloe, you're walking into these tough conversations. What are the challenges that you've found? Is there a general category of challenge that you found most difficult, the toughest nut to crack?
I would say that there are, sometimes in the room when I walk in, there are people with a certain paradigm. And the paradigm is basically, when I say we need to learn how to love, the paradigmatic response is, yes, but there are the oppressors and there are the oppressed, and there's this elite group of people who are deeply incentivized to keep things the way, running the way they're being run. And so I like all of the stories that you're telling me about how people have confronted hatred with love and all of these things, and I agree with those, but isn't there just a conspiratorial thing happening? Mm-hmm. And my response is always twofold. Number one, do you think that the people who responded to hatred with love, fundamentally and existentially, in a sort of reductive sense of the word, identified as oppressed? Because from a psychological perspective, if you are responding to hatred with love, there has to be some kind of wholeness within you to be able to respond that way in the first place. To be able to not meet hatred with hatred, there has to be some kind of different worldview that you're operating according to. And it's not that materially you're not oppressed at all. It may very well be the case that you're materially oppressed in some ways, but that there is another identity that actually transcends that you are operating according to, that person who's meeting hatred with love is operating according to. And which brings me to my second point, which is that isn't it still a caricaturing and an act of stereotyping to superimpose this paradigmatic dichotomy, oppressor versus oppressed, onto these people who are feeling whole? And by the way, a lot of these holistic people, when they are experiencing supremacist tendencies or experiencing someone who is caught in the ideology of supremacy, they're actually able to recognize that that person is unwell. They're actually able to see beyond the facade of this projection of power and realize that this person is actually acting from deep-seated senses of insecurity and overcompensating for it. And you have to be integrated and whole within yourself to be able to see past that facade. But again, the act of wholeness and the act of integration, which we know in a certain context on sort of a systemic level, but less on the psychological level, the act of integration within yourself takes work. And so the question is, and I think we are at a crisis level in our country, will there be enough people who do the work of that integration such that they can become whole and meet the broken and meet the sick and meet the ill with that ethos that Dr. King described as inherent in the beloved community, which requires that we enter into communion with all people, not just people that agree with us, and not just people that are quote unquote good, right? This is hard and difficult work, but I think it's necessary, and I think we're at an emergency level right now in this country.
So you're starting to see why when Chloe's name came up in our dispatch Slack, and every single one of our young reporters says, I want to interview her. So I think you're beginning to see why. Thomas, so I'm gonna throw a social media question at you. One thing that I've been impressed is you get a lot of incoming. You get a lot of incoming, but you maintain you maintain graciousness in the face of that incoming, and you stay yourself. And I've always admired that. And I guess the question I have is, when you're going, because in our world, we have to think about not just our long form written word, we also have to think about the 280 character written word. How are you approaching that world of social media, and do you see it as from a necessary evil, that in other words, for my career and job, I kind of have to be here? Or do you see it as a way that we can actually help turn around the ship?
Both. I thank you, first of all. I appreciate that. And you're somebody whose presence on there I also deeply admire, and you kind of set a very good example. I saw Zadie Smith a few months ago, and she was like, get off of social media. Why are you on social media? This is crazy. And I basically said to her, if I were as famous as you, I would be off tomorrow. Because I think it is part of my job. But like, our editor is in the crowd here, and he might disagree that it's part of our job, actually. And maybe I should, and maybe it's just something that I tell myself, that you have to be on social media as a journalist, and that makes it easy to not, do the more difficult work of forcing yourself off something that's kind of addictive because of the dopamine it releases when you have enough people, interacting with you. But I do think that I don't want to completely abandon it also because there is a lot of good that comes out of it. I want to be involved in this conversation. I think that these are very important conversations. There's a lot of junk that goes on, but you can sometimes make interventions that matter. Mm-hmm. And I have had this experience over and over again where somebody writes you later and says that I've been thinking about this thing, and you helped me see through it. And maybe I don't agree with you fully on this, but I enjoy like seeing you modeling disagreement in a way that seems productive and doesn't seem like full of hatred. Mm-hmm. And I think that matters. I don't want to cede that terrain only to the angriest and loudest voices. I want to kind of stay there for that reason. But I also learn some things, and I just genuinely enjoy disagreement and argument. And so I don't actually hate when somebody's telling me I'm wrong. I mean, there are so many ways in which someone can disagree with you that are productive from the perspective of somebody who's trying to think publicly. Mm. And so I have a kind of experience on social media where I'm not in an echo chamber. I'm actually getting yelled at from both sides a lot, but I think that that's actually a very good, uncomfortable place from which to kind of interrogate your own biases and assumptions. So that's my plea for letting me stay on.
We know one practice I have is for every person I follow on the left, I follow someone else on the right, vice versa. So that I try to
You always do that?
Since I became aware that I was building a bubble, I made that rule so that I never feel disconnected from what other people are thinking. And it's really helped me see things through other people's eyes. Last question to you before we go to questions here. You've been working in engaging with people for many years on the ground and also in the grass tops and grassroots. More pessimistic, less pessimistic, and why?
Well, as some of you have heard me say this, I don't think about it in terms of an optimism-pessimism frame. I think about it through a hopeful, not hopeful frame.
I like that better. That's a better question.
Because
more hopeful,
implies
less hopeful.
agency. Optimism is a bit more of a spectator's stance, or pessimism as well, right? And I think the agency that is implied in hope is about the responsibility taking that we all have to do, right? And so when Chloe's talking about this radical commitment to humanizing each other and to finding that seed of love in the engagement with the least desirable other you're in company with, or where Thomas is talking about building this habit, this muscle of, hearing from both sides or all sides and having your assumptions and biases checked. These are commitments that we have to make, right? This is not just a thing that panelists are talking about. Like each of us making that commitment over and over again is what changes things over time, right? And I think the thing that I would say is, the reason why I am hopeful is that I think we're in a moment right now where there's a synthesis to be made. It's not just this interpersonal or intrapersonal stuff we're talking about. The paradigmatic pushback that Chloe's talking about getting has a germ of relevance to it. If we could fix everything just by being more loving people, we would have fixed stuff by now. There also are structures of power, there are habits of power, there are allocations of power that make it harder for us actually to go there, right? And that's not an excuse. That is one of the principles of a better argument that we talked about is a better argument is one that is honest about power and honest about power differential. It's a lot easier for us to have this kind of conversation in this room. It's a lot easier in this space for someone who is right of center to moderate a panel here because Aspen is that kind of place, right? But go 20, 40 miles anywhere from here to any town, and it's not so easy to have this, to hold this kind of space, right? Power, because in those places, power is allocated in ways that have led people to be zero-sum, scarcity-minded, feeling like I got to hold on to what I have, and I'm going to glom onto a tribe, and the only way I'm going to find meaning and purpose here is to make sure there's someone else to step on top of, right? That's our politics right now. And there are material realities to that are about not necessarily oppression of race, but oppression of class. We're living through 40 years of the most severe radical inequality and wealth concentration that this country has seen, and Aspen is a literal monument to that. It is a literal monument to that, and we, by being here, are literal builders of the monument, whether or not our work is intended to or not. And so we bear a doubled responsibility from being in this room to take ownership of how we're going to change the way that people engage each other. Be honest about power. If you're engaging in a conversation about, I'm from Seattle, right? Starbucks, Amazon, unionization, the labor movement, right? Lots of opinions, lots of stuff where people want to put each other in a box there. You've got to be able to engage that, number one, from a perspective that is humanizing, right? Someone who's at Starbucks in a corporate role and worried about unionization isn't just the old-fashioned kind of grind them down kind of capitalist pig. And someone who's in the organizing movement isn't just a socialist who wants to do away with private property, right? There are complexities here, but more than that, beyond just the humanization, is the recognition of the power structure and the power imbalance that leads this conversation to existence in the first place. We wouldn't be having a resurgent labor movement in this country if capitalism had been working for all workers, period. And let's be honest about that. We've had 40 years of a structure in which power has accrued to capital. And labor is now saying, hey, and pandemic has opened up a channel for that hey to be, hey, F you, and we're in a new place. And the only way to build trust in that context is to be real about that, right? And there are structural patterns here that are both inherited and perpetuated by us. that if we don't name them and we just think it's about the purely interpersonal, then we're also not going to get there. And I think that's a commitment we all have to make together.
All right, we've got time for a few questions, so let's go right here for number one, and then if there's a backup person, okay, up here in the front.
Great, thank you. My name is Yasha Monk. I'm a huge fan of each and every single one of you on that stage. You really each have demonstrated incredible bravery, and you are able to speak truth to your own side, which is the hardest thing to do in politics, and I'm really grateful to all of you. The one concern I have about this panel is that most people are not going to have that unusual courage and that unusual integrity. And so in order to get to an America in which we trust each other, we somehow have to change the incentives for people who are a little bit less brave and a little bit less courageous than you to be able to encounter each other without risking their livelihoods, without risking, being dragged on Twitter and so on. So I would love to hear any thoughts you might have about how we can make it a little bit easier for others to follow in your example.
Can I jump in on that? I think this is why, in the earlier session that I had about this project called What Every American Should Know, where people are invited to make little top 10 lists of things they think every American should know, that little simple conceit is a sideways way into what is otherwise a toxic, polarizing, burn it down conversation about American identity and race and history, right? And I would say the same is true of Civic Saturdays. By inviting people into a gathering to ask, how are we taking responsibility for our community? What is the way in which we've inherited some great ideas and ideals in this country and are not living up to them in our place, in our town? You're coming at things sideways. And I would say that general strategy of don't always do the frontal, let's talk about CRT. Let's talk about the most polarizing thing, but rather, art has an incredible power to create space and invitation for people to humanize and engage without feeling like they're risking it all, because art is fundamentally about questions, not answers. Art is about invitation, not dogma, right? And anything we can find that is about invitation rather than dogma, and any space we can hold at every scale, the more we can build that muscle and habit. And I think, look, how many of you are members of a club of any kind? Doesn't have to be civic. Okay, until everybody in this room is raising their hand, we're not going to get there. The way that you do this in a way that is not about the risk, the high risk of what are you going to, are you going to get dragged on Twitter, is join a club, stay in the club, bring other people in that club who might not be like you, and keep on being part of that club. It can be a gardening club, it can be a civic club, it can be a political club, it can be whatever, right? A music club, a book group. But that art of association is where we will, in our peripheral vision, encounter how to deal with these kinds of polarizing differences and build that muscle of dealing with that, rather than having it in our focal kind of point of our lens, which, as Twitter shows us, when you look at it square like that, it incents people to be their worst selves.
One thing that just to answer that question from somebody, somebody in my position who has some degree of public voice, is that I try to intentionally fight for the rights of people with whom I disagree. Because one of the things that you'll find when somebody is under siege, just as a human being, they're desperate for a defense. They're desperate for somebody to stand up and to stand beside them. And when somebody stands beside them who doesn't necessarily agree with them, I think that it does two things at once. One, from being in that position myself, I know it's like finding an oasis in the desert. Just it is an act of love and compassion and kindness. It's literally life-giving when you're under stress. But the other thing that's so important about it is that it says that there's a kind of solidarity that we have with each other as human beings, that you're just not going to be alone if you are unfairly attacked. If you're being unfairly persecuted, you are not alone. And I think that one of the things that causes so many people to feel so afraid in the public square right now is they are going to feel isolated, cut off, and alone. And the more that you can make somebody feel like they are not alone, that they have an ally, and even an ally who would otherwise disagree with them on 90% of the time, I think that has a powerful force. That is a powerful force. And so I have a kind of a legal corollary to the golden rule that I try to apply, which is fight for the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself. And I think that that has a potent effect. All right, and there was, somebody's already got right here. Yes, and then next right here.
I've really enjoyed hearing your perspectives, so I could go on by how much it's been fun. But I have two questions, limited to two. One is to you, where you talked about union and all of that. How do you see it resolving itself? Do you see it kind of...
How do I see what?
How do you see the union movements and all of that? How do you see that resolving itself? That's one. And then for you, you mentioned about how until enough people who seek their own truth, we won't... How do you feel? Do you feel hopeful, not hopeful? Would love to hear that too.
I'll paraphrase at least my part of the question, which was, how do I see the union fight or argument itself? Was that what you were asking? And I think zoom out from union versus management to the question of, and there are people in this room from organizations that are big businesses who are thinking in these terms, what is the point of a market economy? The point of a market economy is to solve as many problems as we can by tapping into the maximum genius of people in the least directed way. And to put it in other terms, we are strongest when we are able to maximize the number of fit and able competitors to engage in the competition and in the work, right? And so to put it in terms that may be more love-centered, we're all better off when we're all better off, right? I was very involved in the Fight for 15 in Seattle, my hometown. And I did so as a capitalist, because when you raise the wage from 7 or 9 to 11 or 12 or 15, where do you think those workers park that extra $3 or $4 an hour? Do you think they put it in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands? Do they have complex, debt instruments that they're securitizing? No, they spend it, right? They circulate that money into the economy. When workers have more money, businesses have more customers. And that creates a positive feedback loop of increasing demand that makes the economy stronger as an ecosystem, right? And so I think you got to start with this ecosystemic view. An economy is a garden. And when you see it that way, when things get out of whack in any ecosystem, and one part of the ecosystem has too much concentrated power, it's not just that it's bad or, it's not just that we're being mean to the workers. It's that it's bad for the bosses too. Mm-hmm. Because eventually those enterprises are going to crater when they don't have customers who can afford to buy their products, when they can't actually make rent, when they pull back. We're living through some of that in the economy right now, right? And so I think, this is not just about the union versus management in a zero-sum way. It returns us to this question of what are the values at stake? What are the underlying narratives that we're trying to get at? And what are our shared goals here? I do think it's possible to both have a new narrative and have new forms of practice that advance that narrative.
So the question was, given that I believe that more people have to pursue wholeness, am I hopeful or not hopeful that this is actually happening or going to happen in the near future? And I would say, I see more people yearning for it, and I see more people, quite frankly, doing things like studying the sermons of Dr. King and studying the philosophies of those who have come before us who have advanced this. We're part of our nation's history. And scarcity has a way of forcing the issue. And I do believe, like I said, that we're at a boiling point when it comes to scarcity, both material and psychological. And I am hopeful because I see a lot of people moving in that direction, but there's no guarantee. Right? There's no guarantee in any of this, and so that's why we have to actively commit to doing this work. And I just want to say that we often talk about systems, and I am totally on board with what you're saying, but the most complex system in the known universe is the human being. And we have been speaking for so long about institutional systemic change and environmental systemic change, and all of that is so important. But if we don't deal with this here, then none of that is going to be sustainable. None of it.
All right. Well, we only have 27 seconds, so I don't think I'm going to cover it. But I don't know if people will be available for a bit to answer questions, but we really, really, really appreciate it. And thank you all very much for
Thank you,
your
David.
comments and your work.